Great, we're on quest 33. It's called the Irish Line, but it's also called the Great Eire as well, or the Great Eire. So what do we mean by those two terms? Well, the first, it's got a duality aspect to it, I guess, a dual aspect. So what we're looking at is the Irish Line, and the Irish Line is about the ancestry of myself, the Nevilles, the House of Neville, and how that goes back. That's on one side of the fence. On the other side of the fence, we're looking at the Great Eire, so the Great Irish. So on that side, we're looking at how the GRAIL, if one believes in the GRAIL, how that arrived in certain places around the world, as it were, in certain areas and locations. And those locations that we talk about are referred to in certain circles, in very restricted circles, as Keystone Churches. Now, the reason why they're called Keystone Churches is because the keys to the kingdom, as it were, is the first point that's mentioned in some of the scriptures that refer to Keystone Churches that is not in the public domain. And I don't think it ever will be in the fullest extent, really. And then the second one is about the stone, because we all talk about the stone and we talk about the ashlar. So it's about the key and stone and the church itself. So it's not always about the church itself, although it's made reference in a modern day world to Keystone Church, because there are times where it's suggested the GRAIL had its travel in hiding, that it would not necessarily be where the church was built at that point in time. It would be where, later on in the more current years and the here and now, where we see the church is built on that particular location where the keystone was held, i.e. where the GRAIL was suggested to have been at that point in time. What we do know, through various scriptures that aren't in the public domain, is that the GRAIL did many journeys across the way. Sometimes it only spent a decade, 10 years in one place. There are other times it may spend 100 years in a place. And it all depends on the points in time and the circumstances that placed the GRAIL suggestively in that location and then moved on. So we talk about the Keystone Churches. Now there's two in particular that we visited, and one was St Michael's Church in Bray, which sadly was closed at the time, but we got enough information off of the architecture, feel for the area, to recognise how nice St Michael's Church is. We know that the church sort of dates from around about 1293, and it's got a particular, but obviously the GRAIL was there at a very different time. So it's a bit, what came first, the chicken or the egg? Was the church built where, as I suggested, the GRAIL would have been, or did the GRAIL go to that particular location because it knew that the church would be built at a later point in time? So it's all about energies. And before I talk about more about where we've been, so that's St Michael's Church, let's talk about a church and what that truly means. And I think it's important for whatever religion, whatever denomination you follow, be it anything in life, any spiritual path that you follow, the word church or temple comes into the play. Now the meaning of church is purely to mean a collection, a gathering of people. What we've got to really consider is that gathering of people are creating a series of energies from their own bodies, from their own bioelectricity, from their own magnetic forces, from their aura, if you like, dare we use the term aura. And so when we have a series of creatures focusing on one single thing at one single point in time, that's a very powerful source. And that's what we've spoken about in the past, about the power of thought. So is it that the church, in the sense, needs the parishioners in order to raise that energy, or does the church, i.e. the people that attend a church or a temple or a spiritual building, is it that they go there because they need the person that's in position there? I'm trying to use the word power because that's a bit alarming, isn't it? But the person in position there to guide them, to teach them and to show them. It's a hard one to answer because we all have these gut instincts, and that's what we often look at, gut instincts and how we feel in certain places and certain times. And you can certainly get that from KARL'S in Wales, which was our next church that we went to. Now that was another St Michael's church named, quite interestingly enough, in a place called KARL'S, in Llandrindod, Wales. Now KARL'S is an abandoned, what some people class as a ghost village. However, it didn't seem very abandoned to me. There was a hive of energy and activity going on there. The church itself is fascinating, and it goes back to, that was the original village, the original medieval village that was there in KARL'S. And what happened over time is it's a very rough terrain, it's very uneven, lots of little mounds and mountainous range. And so at some point in its existence, people started to move to a more levelled area just down the road, literally, to create Llandrindod, Wales. And there's always quite some interesting stories with KARL'S, because the new church was built in Llandrindod, Wales, and there's a point in reference that talks about how the vicar was furious that people were still going to the original church, St Michael's Church, up in the medieval village that was abandoned. He was furious that he went over and physically himself removed the roof of that said church, in his thought process, thinking, well, if there's no roof, they won't want to go there and they'll come to my church. So it's interesting how time changes everything, because in today's world we think, oh my God, that's horrific, and you'd get arrested for criminal damage. But back in the day, that was probably classed as quite a heroic thing for a vicar, a rector, a priest, a minister, whatever you want to label them as, to do. So, and again, that changes the time, doesn't it? Most churches that we visit, if we have the privilege and opportunity to speak to the person who is there, i.e. the rector, minister, whichever, what generally is the number that comes to mind is, most people tell me, oh, we get about, on average, about 30 parishioners at a time. So it just shows how the times have changed, because take it back 200, or take it back 100 years ago, you know, there's that ritualistic Sunday morning, dressed up in your Sunday best, and that's it, all brushed up and hair combed and everything, and everyone goes off to the church, you know, and then after that they'd go home to have dinner. I think in some respects it's nice that the world has changed, but I can't help but get a sense of disappointment would be the word. I wouldn't say disgust, that's wrong, but I'd say a word of disappointment. The majority of people that take their children to McDonald's on a Sunday morning as opposed to attending a spiritual building. Is it that we've moved away from spirituality? Are we looking more at a scientific value? Who knows? What is science? What is religion? What is spirituality? They're all just labels, aren't they? But it's about how we've changed over time. You know, we have Sunday trading now. That, you know, 100 years ago, 200 years ago, that would never have happened. You wouldn't have even back in medieval time, you wouldn't have a medieval market on a Sunday, because that was a day, the holy day. And in other religions, they have a holy day as a Saturday. But again, when we look at these calendars and when we look at churches, we're operating on a Gregorian calendar. Now, if we go back to the Julian calendar, or even before that, days don't really matter, which means that time doesn't really matter. But we seem to use this point in time as a point of measurement in a world that's very hectic and chaotic. And it almost begs the question, what would we do if time just didn't exist? But does it exist? It only exists in our minds and how we operate our lives, and how we, if we look at the farmers of today, and especially around this area where we are now, which is absolutely beautiful. We're in a place called Shannonvale, and the area here, you can see that some people work literally sun up to sundown, you know, and that is a day when the sun rises, they start their day, and when the sun goes down, that's when they finish, because it's farming communities. So I think there's a lot to be said about time and how we view time, as it were, because it is such a mishmatchy, jumbled up sort of thing, really, I guess. So that was that. We stayed in a very nice place in Eire in Wales, and then we went off to GRAIL Stone Circle, which, yes, okay, it's a modern stone circle erected in 1948. but it's assembled like many things on a very older site. Now, do we think that's Grail energy or pyramid energy? I would suggest it's pyramid energy. Grail energy seems to focus itself around the foresaid Keystone Churches, as it were, so the Keystone Church pathway across certain areas. So the stone circle again was quite interesting. There is a story about the Keystone Circle where it is said in myth and legend that a particular lady of the night had her bones rested within that place for a period of time. How true that is, we don't know. But there has to be some kind of meat on the bone. There has to be something that says, well, they didn't just make it up out of air. There's a reason why they've talked about this Lady of the Night. And what did that mean exactly? Do we mean from a vampiric point of view, or do we mean from a working lady, for want of a better term, for sexual pleasures? What does that mean? So there's a few unanswered questions there regards to that particular stone circle, but it certainly felt really good and really nice, and certainly worth a visit there in Wales, in Gwynedd, in the district of Gwynedd in Wales, really. After that, we went to Barmouth. Now, Barmouth is a beautiful place, and it's got some very interesting points there as well. And we went to the St Mary's Church there, which is connected to St Thomas Neville, my fourth great-grandfather, or one of my fourth great-grandfathers. And he was around on planet Earth from 1810 to 1893, so he had about 83 years worth of existence here, which is quite interesting because, as I always talk about in Life, the Universe and Everything, I always mention about how each and every one of us have about this 80-year mark. That's the average, isn't it, for a human species in today's world. If we're lucky, we get those 80 years. And with those 80 years, it's such a short period of time, which makes us all really quite insignificant, doesn't it? You know, what's our purpose? Why are we here? And will someone remember us in 100 years' time? And why should someone remember us in 100 years' time? Were we that important? You know, so it doesn't matter who you are, where you come from, what you do in your life. The main thing for life is just to live it, I think, really. Just live it, experience it, and have as many great experiences as you possibly can. Now, one thing that's really interesting about experiences, it doesn't mean flying off to New York or doing all those things. The most interesting experiences that you'll have on this particular plane, this particular realm, can be the most minute thing that you suddenly realise 5 years from now, or 5 years from when the particular situation occurred. Think, wow, that happened, and that was amazing. And it just pops into your head because your subconscious is always computing all these different scenarios and things that you've experienced over years, and all of a sudden it just plucks it back out of the subconscious straight into the air, and you verbalise it. The same as when you remember a song, and all of a sudden you're just driving along one day or walking along the road, and a song pops into your head that you might not have heard for, say, 10-15 years. You think, where did that come from? That's your subconscious, because your subconscious takes on so much more than your conscious state is aware of. I talk a lot about the mind and spirits and things in my next book, which is called, when it comes out, is going to be called When the Trumpet Sounds. And it's all about life and what you really do with this life here. It doesn't matter what you do, really, as long as you have fun along the way and you treat people with respect. That's the most important things, I think, to think about. You know, it's not always easy to treat people with respect if they're being rude to you, or they're deceiving you, or those sort of things. But, there's a big but, anger, hatred, jealousy, those three words will always consume you and will burn you out. The best thing you can do is revert that round, turn that table round, disperse those thoughts and processes, and say, well, there's always a karma somewhere. What will be, and the wonderful phrase, what goes around comes around. It'll always come back and knock on their door, even if it's when it's death knocking. Because there's one thing that's certain, that when death knocks on your door, he never goes away alone. And that's always one thing to remember, I guess. So churches, back to here. Wales, what a beautiful, beautiful country. I really hope it gets its independence one day. Oops, that sounds political, but I think they should, because, you know, independence and cultural independence is quite important, I think. In the scheme of things, there is no borders between lands and things, but I really do believe that you know, there are certain areas that should have their cultural independence back. And if that means they get their country back in a political stance and in a everyday hustly bustly way, then fair enough, if that's what enhances their cultural independence from other areas and other locations. Anyway, so we got onto the ferry. Irish ferries, brilliant as always, lovely sail across. This time, it was only about 9 weeks ago, I think, per se, that we went from Liverpool to Belfast. This time round we've gone from Holyhead to Dublin, which we have done that route before. Nice little journey, lovely little trip there. Arrived in Dublin, and then we drove all the way down to Knocknagushel. Knocknagushel is a very, very interesting place. It's got so much history steeped there in that particular area. So much so to King Rexmar, which is my 61st great-grandfather. If you delve into those sort of things, I've got everything on Ancestry Online, in the infamous Ancestry websites and things. And he was around about 95 AD to 119 AD, so he wasn't around too long. But what's interesting, he was actually at the Gallimore Stone Circle in Dingle, where we actually had the privilege to go and visit. And that was lovely. That was really, really good. What an energy, what a place. Very much worth a little visit just to see it, I guess, if nothing more. After that, we went on to the Church of St James in Dingle. Now, again, sadly it was closed, and it was a bit of a disappointment there, really, because I always wonder why these churches are closed. Yes, we've got a little bit of COVID going on, probably a bit more than a little bit. However, it's okay for you to go and sit in a restaurant and eat with all these strangers and just put your little mask on, as if that's going to protect you. Put your little mask on when you get up from the table to go and use the bathroom. When you get back to your table to eat, you take your little mask off, and apparently you're protected, because all the air around your table has got this magical protection that you're not going to get COVID. Isn't that amazing? But how dare you think about going into a church that's a massive, great open building, full of air ventilation, lots of, and very little people going in there, sadly these days, as we've already mentioned, and they remain closed. I can't really understand the human logic there. There has to be something there, doesn't there? But needless to say, the church was closed, so God wasn't home that day, sadly, at St James's. But an interesting church nevertheless. Disappointing because it's connected to Earl William Neville, my fifth great uncle, from the 4th Earl of Abergavenny. So a bit of a shame there that we couldn't get into there, but it is what it is. Dunmore Head, what a lovely place that is. Absolutely lovely. Now that's connected to a direct great-grandfather of mine, so much more recent in times. Richard Chaz, he was known as, Richard Neville. Now, interesting, he lived from 1899 right through to 1985. So, you know, it's a fairly recent connection there. But Richard himself was, or Chaz as he was known, was very interested in Dunmore Head for a multitude of reasons that I probably shouldn't share here today. But it's very much worth going there to look at energies and things and see Dunmore Head. It is most relevant on the quest because of the energy lines that are there. There are some ancient ley lines, if you believe in that sort of thing, but ancient energy lines that cross through particular Dunmore Head. And we've got to bear in mind that the lands and the oceans were different if we take it back a few millennia. You know, the lands were very different. So we're sort of seeing it from a linear approach in a here and now world. And what we need to do is open our minds and see whatever area we visit across all times. What was that area like before? How high was the sea level? Was there land mass that sunk into the sea? If so, what does that mean? So there's so much to look at there in regards to Dunmore Head. We left Knocknagushel. Now, we went on to the Daniel O'Connell Church and Oratory in Cahashavin, and what a place. Amazing. Couple of Grail clues in there, if you believe in the Grail quest and the Grail hunts, but there was a couple of nice clues in there that were certainly photographed and noted. It's interesting that it's the only church in Eire, in Ireland, that's named after a countryman. Isn't that interesting? Out of all the churches in Ireland, in Eire, not in Northern Ireland, but all the churches in Ireland, it's named after a countryman, Daniel O'Connell Church and Oratory, which is quite interesting. Connected to Earl Gospatrick MacMordred, my 26th great-grandfather, which is quite interesting because we're looking from where we are down in or down sort of across the west side of County Kerry, and then we're looking at my 26th great-grandfather from Scotland. So we're looking at where's the connection there. There's a strong connection. Now the most obvious connection is Celtic lands. When we think of Celtic lands, if anyone ever gets the opportunity to look at these things, Celtic lands cover Scotland, Wales, parts of Cornwall, Brittany in France, as we well know, and Ireland. So we've got 5 main Celtic lands there, that are all. So there is a very strong connection between these places, and that's why we often see Scottish names in Ireland, Irish names in Scotland. Then we've got Muck, and then we've got Mac. So all those things come to play really. After that church, we went on to Shannonvale Cottage, which was lovely to stay at. And then after that, we went on to excuse me. After that, we went on to St Fartner's Cathedral, which was quite interesting. Now, so I have momentarily, I'll go back to that in a moment. We saw St Fartner's Cathedral. Now, what a place again. The current reverend there, it's a Church of Ireland church. The current reverend there is retiring shortly. He's been in the area since 1985 at that particular church, and it's a cathedral. It's the smallest cathedral. Amazing place. Again, there were some very interesting Grail clues within there. It is a Keystone Church again, as we know, and I would suggest that the Keystone, in the sense that it is suggested, the Grail may have very well been there in the year 590 AD, 590 AD. So, and that would make a lot of sense to me if we look at how the pathway of the Grail goes through, if we believe in that sort of thing. So it's there. Let's not forget that we also went to the remains of the Church of St John the Baptist on Valencia Island. Now, Valencia Island is quite special as well because there's 3 main points really. From our previous quest, we went to Achill Island. This time we've gone to Dingle, coming down that coastline to another furthest point. And this time we've gone on to Valencia Island, which is another furthest point. Now those 3 points, Valencia Island, Dingle, area of Dingle and Achill Island, those 3 areas are quite well connected to so much energy line that beggars belief. Those 3 points are very amazing for Ireland and certainly makes it what is known as the Emerald Isle for a multitude of reasons. So, church is obviously derelict. Very blusty day, very windy up there on the hillside or the cliffside even, overlooking the ocean. Some interesting energies there, some very negative energies, but very positive at the same time. It was almost like a battle going on, which was quite interesting to experience, as it were. We've got the Glen Cemetery Old there as well, which we just talked about the cliff tops and the ruins and stuff. The Glen Old Cemetery is connected to Earl Gospatrick MacMordred again, this time 1042 to 1082. Not a lot to say about that, but there was one thing at that particular church, the Glen Cemetery, the old cemetery there. There was a gravestone that was a fairly modern, I'd say modern gravestone, probably post 1970s, 1980s, I guess. And all the lettering that was on that particular gravestone, or headstone should I say, was spray painted black over it. but not like a standard, like a graffiti, which someone would do out of disrespect. It was blotting out the name of the person that was actually buried there. And that fascinated me, because I thought, well, why did the person do something in life that was later found out? And out of disgust, someone's just sprayed the name off? Or was it a case that the grave was not to be known to anyone else? But it was a very strange thing to see, because out of the entire old cemetery, it was the only gravestone, the only headstone that actually had this black spray paint very carefully, just over where the wordings of the words were. So that was quite interesting to see, really, I guess. We went on to Drombeg Stone Circle in Glandore, County Cork. Now, that's connected to King Niall, my 53rd great-grandfather, and we're looking at 311 to 378. So he lived on this particular plane for about 67 years, which is, in that particular time, it was pretty good going for that year and that period, I guess. The stone circle's amazing there, but let's not lose the focus that the reason why that site's there is a lot of it was used for sacrificial purposes. Now, when we go there, there's a little what I call watering pools, or what was known as welling pools, and so they were quite negative in a way. But it still had a lot of interesting energies there, but I can only put that down to probably the volume of humans that was sacrificed there over the centuries, really. But it was also used for other positive things in times past as well. But an interesting site. It's very photogenic and very interesting. It's also interesting, there's a lot of little offerings that people have left there when they've gone there, which is quite nice to see, I guess. But let's not lose the focus. There's the Dromberg Circle itself, there's a little welling pool, you've got the altar, which was a sacrificial altar, but you've also got all these wonderful little caves and rocks and things that are sort of buried in the sands or mud of time. Don't lose sight of those, because you can focus too much on the circle and forget what's actually around the peripheral, what's around the edges of the area that are still hidden, probably never to be excavated, I guess, but very interesting, needless to say. So we talked about St Falkner already, which is quite nice. We talked about the Drombeg Stone Circle. On Saturday, which was yesterday, we went to St Finbarr's Cathedral. We had a really interesting conversation with Michael there. What a wonderful guy, very spiritual, very nice. We went to a lovely private service with the Dean there, who took a service about 30 minutes, very nice as well. You could sense the Dean in particular was very reverent. I wouldn't say in the sense of, what I mean by that is he's very spiritual and very believing and very humble, which is quite nice to sense and see, that the position hasn't gone too much to his head. So it was lovely to see him in such a sincere role, undertaking a sincere act, and also speaking with us in a very sincere way. And I think that's what any spiritual leader should lean towards, really. So St Finbarr's Cathedral, very interesting cathedral in itself. Again, connected to Earl Gospatrick MacMuldred, 26th great-grandfather. Lots of different symbols in that church, if you know where to look. Now, the only thing I'd like to say on video is that sometimes if you state the obvious, it becomes the unobvious. So the most simplistic things can be the most valuable things in the sense of spiritual value, as opposed to all the glitz and the glamour and the gold guilds and that sort of thing. So if you went there to visit St Finbarr's Cathedral and you actually look for the simplicity within the cathedral itself, you're halfway there. Very nice place. And Michael and the Dean, very nice people. It was lovely to see such interesting, sincere people in the church, or in the cathedral, as it were, but in the diocese, which is really nice. Really nice to see. We went on to Christchurch in Ireland, to Fermoy. Lovely place, Fermoy, but sadly the church was closed. It was also in a little bit of ill repair, to say the least, in the sense that it had weeds, or as my learned friend has told me, in Cambridge they now call weeds wild flowers and wild plants. I'm amazed. It's a label anyway, but there was these wild plants, there was these weeds growing on the tower and things. It obviously didn't have the right monies, I guess, forwarded to it to maintain the building. I was uncertain whether the building was still in use, because one of the notice boards I noticed has been cleared off or cleaned off, but there was still the main church board outside saying who was the reverend for the church. But what happens these days in current times, often there's a reverend for 4 or 5 churches in the area, so perhaps that church isn't used a great deal now and just locked up unless it's a funeral, unless it's either a hatches, a matches or dispatches. One of those 3, perhaps it's the only time it's used, I guess. I don't know. But it was a shame to see it closed, but it was a fantastic building in its own right. Connected to Lord Robert de Neville, 21st great-grandfather. It's on a very busy junction, which we have seen that sort of church before. It's just such a shame to let that building go to waste. I'd rather like to see that church converted into a homeless shelter or something like that, if there was a need there, or into an activity centre for youth or something, rather than just not used at all, because it's such a waste of a building. So I'm sure there must be some trusts and things that can take that on board and do something positively nice for the community with it. So that's the Christchurch. Today, well, my lord, what can I say about today? Wow, it was such a wow factor from a personal point of view. We went to the Lusitania Museum. Now, for most people who have probably never heard of a Lusitania ship, it was a ship that did several crossings from Scotland down to Ireland, Ireland across to New York, and backwards again. So it did several of those crossings in its time, in its short period of time. It was a state-of-the-art technical... Does this sound familiar to Titanic? It does, doesn't it? But there is a slight twist on there, because it has so much technical stuff on board, so much advanced engineering, that it was classed as a really, really great ship. Now, yes, there was first, second and third class passengers on board, as there will be on most of those ships that certainly travelled the ocean's way. Sadly, the Lusitania was sunk on the 7th of May in the year 1915. Now, it was sunk by a German U-boat who fired a torpedo at it. Now, at that point in time, the Coast Guards and the armourers, the army, the actual artilleries at the time, had tried to send out warning notes and warning signals to the Lusitania to keep 10 miles away from shore, because they knew this U-boat was lurking about, this German U-boat was lurking about somewhere in the water's edge. And so, but for some reason it didn't respond. The Lusitania did not respond for whatever reason that no one knows. Subsequently, the German U-boat, it's always been thought that the German U-boat assumed that the Lusitania was a battleship. So it went into full guard, fires torpedo, hits the central part of the Lusitania, and from the records and reports of survivors, it tilted very quickly indeed, and then subsequently sank. Now, 1,200 souls were lost that day. Out of those 1,200 souls, some of my family members passed on that particular day. Muriel Neville, Evelyn Neville, that was the children. We also had Albert Charles Neville, but he was known as Charles Neville. Now, he was lost that day as well. But what was interesting is that Mabel Neville, one of my great aunts, she survived that. How she survived, I don't know, but she survived the sinking of the Lusitania. Interesting enough, her grave, obviously years later when she dies of natural causes, if there is such a thing as natural causes, but she dies and passes over, her grave is in Watford Cemetery in London, which is fascinating, isn't it? So What's also interesting for me today is that I saw, now I think it might be a confusion, I'm not quite sure, because the father, the husband who died, obviously he was born 1874, so he was, and he died in 1915 in the Sinkings. He was 41 years of age when he died. He was Albert Charles Neville, but he was always known as Charles Neville, which is interesting because that's a Karl Neville really, because Karl from German spelt with a K is Charles. So, and he died at 41. So what's interesting is that on the memorial wave and in the memorial book, there's an Albert Neville and a Charles Neville as two separate people. But in all my records and research, I haven't been able to confirm or deny whether it's an inventory error, and there is this Albert Charles Neville, and not two Nevilles as it were, or whether there's a Charles Neville or an Albert Neville that I'm not aware of. But as far as I'm aware, there was only ever, although saying that, again, I'd have to do a lot more research on that, to be fair. It would make sense if the father was Albert Charles Neville, then he would have probably called his son, if there was a son, Charles Neville. So that is a possibility. I don't think it's real, but I think it's a possibility. So that I'm finding quite fascinating at the moment. That was my revelation from today. But what a place! They my hat off to the people that have organised that, got the charity rolling, raised 2.6 million. So it's really interesting to see whether there is this additional person or not. Really, it's going to take a bit of research, passenger records, and that to see that. But what a place! Absolutely amazing. It's got some really good history, and the videos that are sort of on a repeat play, like in most museums, the videos themselves in the tower are amazing to watch, because it really brings it to home, because it's real footage back to the day, footage from that to the modern time, which is really, really good. So that's the Lusitania itself. What a ship! It's so similar, isn't it, to the when we think about ships and sinking, we always think, oh, Titanic, because we know that one. But mention the Lusitania to people, they go, what? What's that then? So yeah, I implore you to have a look at that and see. It was wartime. That's not the least we forget, or not forget rather. It was wartime, and so it was a simple mistake that was made. Interesting. There was a chap of my name, or I'm of his name really, KARL'S or Grotz, and he designed a medal based around the Lusitania, and his little medal portrayed the Lusitania as having guns and things on it as well, so to try and sort of lower the tone of saying, oops, we've blown up a civilian ship. So but it happened, I guess, in wartime. We hear it in today's world in wartime that civilians' lives are lost because of war. In error, human error, whatever error, it's an error, isn't it? So it happens, rightly or wrongly. But I think what's important is to remember those sort of places and remember the people and the lives that are on that ship and the experiences they must have had, even being on that fascinating ship to the point that it actually sank. You know, to survive that, as Mabel Neville did, one of my great aunts. For Mabel to survive that, she lost her entire family that day. I can't even begin to imagine what that feels like, to lose your husband and your children in one single day. Again, it beggars belief. You know, how do you carry on after that? But you have two choices. You know, it's life, so life is for living. So I suppose in some respects she lived because she was determined to live for the sake of her lost love of her husband and children. But what a way, what a way. You know, sometimes I think the cards of fate are dealt to people in a really severe way. And I think we all need to be thankful really that we wake up in the morning and we're living and breathing, and those that we love are still around us in our lives at this point in time. And I think that's a privilege. It's not a blessing, it's a privilege. I think that's a better word to use, to be fair. Anyway, after that, we went on to Martello Tower. Now Martello Tower, there's lots of Martello Towers as we know. They were built in the war times to protect the edges, and so there's lots of Martello Towers all around different areas. But this particular Martello Tower is at Ringaskiddy, and what was interesting is the sat nav took us to, you know, a normal road that you turn off to get to it. Fair enough. And as we turned off into that road, the side road, there was Eire fencing, you know, metal fencing, 6 foot high, 6 foot across, all sort of bolted across the way and saying construction site do not enter. Didn't say private property though, so that's a big interesting point to make. So we pulled in there. There was not a soul around, so you're on a relatively quiet road going down towards the industrial estate on a Sunday in particular. Tiny little road that turns off there. There was no one around, no one on the roadside, no one hanging around, nothing. So we've gone past, and I thought, do you know what, bugger it, we'll do a U-turn, drive back up that hill, turn back into that little road that's got the construction site fencing, and we'll try to just get round the construction site fencing and get in and walk round to Martello Tower, this particular Martello Tower. So no one was around. When we turned back in, which is a matter of minutes away, probably guesstimate about 3.5 minutes had passed. So there's no way that anyone could have got to that location. We turned into that particular road, and there was a chap that probably looked about 28 to 30 years old. I'd say he's probably about 29 years old. A fairly large build, beard, black hair, wearing almost like a shell suit, I guess. That would be the best way to describe the clothing he's wearing. Had an Apple phone in his hand, an iPhone. You could tell it was an iPhone from the style of it, and it was coloured white. So he had it in his right hand, and he just smiled as we pulled up, and I thought, oh, where did he come from? Got out of the car, and I spoke to him and said, I said, do you know if this is the way to Martello Tower? Thinking he was a local guy. He spoke in a full broken English language, but with a full French accent. Where did this guy appear from? He just turned up out of nowhere. So I said to him, oh, you're from France, I can tell that from your accent. I said, whereabouts in France are you from? He said, oh, just central, he said. I said, oh, you mean Paris? He went, no, central. I said, well, down to Bourges or something like that. Then he told me he was from Chateau L. So I'll have to look at that on the maps and see what that is, Chateau L. I said, all right, he didn't understand. He said, I'm waiting for someone, he said. And he stood there about his business, didn't really move a great deal. I got out of the car, got the umbrellas and things out so I can walk with the umbrella up the road. The sky was dry, sunny, warm. But I noticed the guy, this lad, I say lad, he's 29, this guy just kept on staring at me, and when I stared over back at him, he just kept on smiling at me. I thought, okay. But Janice and I proceeded to go round. As I suspected, there's a little part for dog walkers, so you can walk round. So we walked around where dog walkers would go, and as we walked up towards Martello Tower, the skies out of nowhere just opened with torrential rain. Absolute torrential rain poured down, absolutely soaked. Got the pictures done that we needed to get done and the area. Went back to the car, so again only about 10 minutes had passed, I guess. There was nothing and no one around the area. When we went back down to the car, the gentleman, the lad, the French lad had gone. So it was almost as if he was waiting for us to arrive and then go. Who can say? Who can say? But there was no other reason for him to be at that particular location, because where had he come from to be waiting in such a peculiar location for someone to allegedly pick him up? So it made no sense at all. So yeah, we often have some strange things like that happen when we're on these quests. I'd like to think there's signs and symbols that are given to us saying that we're doing the right thing. I don't know, you could say it's all a load of hogwash, you know, it's rubbish, you know, in that sense, and he was probably just a lad waiting for a lift, as he said. But the reality is that there's no way that how did he get there and where did he come from? And how did he disappear so quick when we were just literally around the corner and then went back to the car and he'd gone? Most peculiar, very peculiar indeed. But the actual Ringaskiddy is connected to Lord Robert de Neville, my 21st great-grandfather, on planet Earth from 1237 to 1271, so he was about 34 years old at the point of his demise. And yeah, interesting place. At least we've managed to tick those boxes. And we certainly have ticked the boxes over the last week. It's been a fascinating week. County Kerry, County Cork, beautiful areas of Ireland. Absolutely stunningly photogenic. Worth anyone in their lifetime that you have to come to Ireland. Don't get on that plane to Cyprus and go on sit on a beach and drink beer, for God's sake, or pop off to Barcelona to get your jug of sangria. Please live a little, see life, enjoy it.